Thanks, Moses, and good afternoon to everyone. We're very excited to be hosting these series of webinars. Next slide, please. Basically, there's 5 webinars, and very, very timely because all of our countries now have laws, or almost all of them. And in fact, the laws are quite comprehensive, and they require action sooner rather than later because they come with huge penalties. So I think this is very timely. You've today joined us for part 1, which is registration with the data protection authorities. And we're going to cover 4 countries: Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya, Mauritius. So I think we've got representation from all countries here. Then we're going to talk about the key roles in data privacy. The next one will be on your compliance journey, and we'll give you lots of advice on, how to comply with the law. We'll also go into detail about the data protection laws within East Africa in part 4. And then we'll give you some tips on how to avoid complaints from regulatory authorities and how to comply in a manner which keeps you on the right side of the law. Let's start off by just talking about what is data privacy. Next slide, please. So simply put, data privacy is the protection of personal data from those who should not have access to it, and the ability of individuals to determine who can access their personal information. Next slide, please. Why has this become such a big deal? We all know that we've heard this phrase, data is the new oil. And this was coined by a guy called Ajay Banga. He's now, when he coined it, he was the MasterCard CEO. He's now moved up. He's now the chairman of, the executive chairman of MasterCard worldwide. And he coined this, and he was basically saying, look, oil is probably the most precious commodity, but data, is probably as precious, if not more precious. In fact, he went on to suggest that data is even more precious because oil is finite. Yeah, and we've only got so much oil reserves, and once they're used up, that's it. Whereas data is just increasing, and the rate at which data is increasing is incredible. I think we're now looking at 100 zettabytes of data, which is the equivalent of I think 100 times the number of stars that we've got in our constellation. So it's a huge number, and it's just growing exponentially. The other thing about data is, unlike oil, it can be reused. So in fact, when it's transformed and it generates new information, it becomes even more valuable. Whereas with oil, it's just discarded after it's been used. So this obviously was seen as an opportunity by large organizations, decades ago. And the problem is that now every organization has just started hoarding data. And because it was so readily available, it was easy to get data, because if you wanted your customers to work with you, the first thing you do is get them to fill forms where you were collecting all sorts of sensitive information like their name, their age, their date of birth, IP address, and other information like religion, beliefs, and also information on health, and sometimes even genetic and biometric data. And a lot of it obviously is used for good because, organizations are able to customize their tools and the products that they give us. So, we get things that are most suited to us, and they can obviously increase their sales as a result of all the information they have. But then on the other side, on the flip side, because this information is everywhere now, hackers are having a field day. And this information, once it gets into the wrong hands, we've all seen the kind of crimes and, cyber crimes and identity theft and all sorts of other fraud that have happened. So that is the reason why countries have just come down with legislation, and it's just going to grow as people find, as there's more violations and as the fines increase, you will find the legislation is just going to be one step ahead all the time. So at the moment, the legislation is providing more protection to consumers, which they didn't have. And consumers' rights in law are just going to increase. So you might be aware that today, coincidentally, the 14th of July is also the day when the registration in Kenya commences. So if you need to register, you get with the Office of Data Protection, with the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner, the Odpc, you can start doing that from today. And under the Kenya Data Protection Act of 2019, no person or organization shall act as a data controller or data processor unless registered with the Data Commissioner. Now, what this means is that if your organization is required to register with the Odpc, and should it fail to do so, your organization cannot process any personal data, for example, names, email addresses, ID numbers, addresses, and so on and so forth. Any personal data shared by your organization with third parties outside your organization cannot continue to be processed either. So what does your organization need to do to comply? Do you know, for example, what data you hold about individuals? And have you done a data inventory? Do you know what are the lawful basis for processing of different categories of personal data? Have you looked at your policies, your privacy policy, your cookie policy, and the standards in place for data protection? Have you reviewed your contracts with your data controllers and data processors? How compliant are your suppliers and vendors when they are handling the organization's personal data? And how secure is the personal data that your company or your organization is processing? Have your employees been trained on data protection? There's quite a lot to do, obviously, for everyone. And the fines for non-compliance are significant. I mean, we are going to go through the fines in each country, but in Kenya, it's 5 billion shillings for non-compliance, or 1% of turnover, whichever is the lower. And there's more, because the individuals or the data subjects whose data has been breached have the right to commence legal proceedings in court to claim for damages. So yeah, it's quite serious. And obviously the fines are different in different countries. So I think on that kind of dark note, let me hand over to Rushda, my colleague. And Rushda, perhaps you can continue with the presentation on a more positive note. Rushda?
Thank you, Zahia, and thank you, Moses, for the introduction. Very good introduction indeed. So we'll start with our first part of the presentation, which would be the registration with Data Protection Authority, Uganda, Rwanda, Kenya, and Mauritius as well. So our agenda for today, we will cover the following topics in this training or webinar. What is a controller and a processor? Because before you register with the Data Protection Office or the Odpc office or the authority in Uganda, Rwanda, you will need to know about your role, whether you are a controller or a processor. Then we will have the registration requirements under the different data protection legislations, how to register, the deadlines, the time frames, registration fees, how we can assist you, and of course, you will have our contact details at the end. So to begin with, what is a controller and a processor? So like I've said before, we go on with the detailed requirements of the registrations, very important for you to know your role as an organization, whether you're classified as a controller or whether you're classified as a processor. Normally, a controller is an organization which processor's personal data. That is, the organization determines the purpose and means of processing personal data. Normally in practice, it is usually the organization as such and not an individual within the organization, such as a CEO, employee, or member of the board that acts as a controller. Because we have nowadays so many organizations, like they are thinking that they need to register every employees in their organization or member of the board, CEO as controller or as processor. No, actually in practice, it is the entity who is considered as a controller or a processor. What is the difference between the controller and the processor? Both are entities, okay? That's the similarities, but the processor processes personal data on behalf of the controller. That is, the controller will give instruction to the processor and the processor will abide by that instruction and process personal data on behalf of the controller. So an organization can be both, can be a controller, can be a processor, or can be both a controller and a processor as well. So the relationship between the controller and the processor can be governed in writing through a contract. So you will need to have a contract between a controller and a processor. Let me give you an example. I will take the example, I think in the chat we have Total Energies with us. Total Energies may be a controller. Why? Because it is processing personal data of its employees. So the Total Energies is, for example, determining how to process the information of employees, for example, for payroll purposes or for any other purposes, leave, performance appraisal, or any other purposes. Now, if we have, like we've said that Total Energies have more than 200 employees, it's difficult for the HR department to do the payroll at the end of each month. So they decide, Total Energies decide to outsource the part of payroll to another organization. So the other organization, let's say BDO will process the part of payroll on behalf of Total Energies. So BDO will become a processor. So both the controller and the processor have their responsibilities and they will need to demonstrate compliance under data protection legislation. And you both will need to register with the relevant data protection authority. So let's see the registration requirements for Mauritius. Actually, in Mauritius, we have the Data Protection Act 2017, which came into force on 15 January 2018. The act mirrors a bit the general data protection regulations. So we have based ourselves on best international practices to make the Data Protection Act 2017. And under section 14 of the DPA, it is mentioned, it is stated that you cannot act as a data controller or data processor unless you are registered with the Data Protection Commissioner. So it's very important for each and every organization to register with the relevant data protection authority. If you fail to register, it is an offense under the DPA under the law. So for Mauritius, normally if the offense is not mentioned, the penalty, the general one, it's 200,000 rupees and an imprisonment of 5 years. So Mauritian Data Protection Act is a criminal law. So you have penalties as well as imprisonment. So how do you need to register in the Mauritian context? The Data Protection Office has come up with two forms. One form is for registration as a controller. The other one is a registration as a processor. And the office has also come up with the online application form. It's only submitting all the information online and the payment you will need to do at the office itself. So if you would like to register as a controller or processor, you need to either fill the form and submit to the Data Protection Office either in hand, by post, or you submit it online through the online submission portal. Then the application will be analyzed by the Data Protection Commissioner, and upon approval, you will be provided with a registration certificate. It is very important to note that in Mauritius, the registration certificate is valid for 3 years. So you will have to renew only after 3 years upon expiration of your registration certificate. So let me just provide you a bit of an update. When the Data Protection Act 2017 came into force in Mauritius, we didn't have at that time the Data Protection Fees Regulation 2020. So in 2020, the Data Protection Office in Mauritius started with the registration process, and all organizations in Mauritius were required to register. A moratory period was provided up to, I would say, December, October. They were provided, all organizations were provided a moratory period to register with the Data Protection Commissioner. So if you have already registered as a controller or processor, normally on your registration certificate, you will have the date of the start date as 1st of August 2020, and your expiry date would be 31st of July 2023. So upon your next year, you will need to renew your registration certificate 3 months prior to your 3 months prior to the expiry of the registration. And normally with the registration as well as the renewal, you have a fees. The fees is based on the number of employees that you have in your organization. For example, if the organization have between 0 to 5 employees, the registration fees as well as the renewal fees would be 1,000 rupees. And for organization between 6 to 25 employees, it would be 1,500, and more than 25 employees, 2,500 rupees. The registration fees for the registration fees and the renewal fees are the same in Mauritius. Then we have particulars of the application forms. Normally, these are under the law. So the application form, when you will see the what is required from you, everything is under the DPA. You will need to provide a name and address of your organization, whether you have a representative or an officer delegated for data protection issues in your organization, also known as a data protection officer, a description of the personal data you're keeping, you're processing, for example, name, address, telephone number, marital status, and every personal data that you're processing. Then description of the categories of data subject. You can have different categories of data subject. Data subjects can be employees, clients, suppliers, shareholders, can be any person that can be identified by their data. Then a statement of whether you are you're processing special categories of personal data, also known as sensitive personal data. Normally in the Data Protection Act 2017, special categories of personal data is data concerning your racial, ethnic origin, biometric, genetic data, health data, and criminal offenses. In Mauritius, all these are considered as special categories of personal data. Then you have a description of the purpose, for which purpose you're processing the personal data, whether it is for payroll purposes, client onboarding, KYC purposes, invoicing, video recording. There are so many purposes that you as an organization are processing personal data, so you will need to be in detail when describing the purposes. Description of the recipient, to whom the personal data transfer, or you're going to share it. For example, if you're transferring it to in Mauritius, we need to, for payroll purposes, we need to share information with the Mauritius Revenue Authority. For tax purposes, so you can share it with the bank for the payment. So there are many different recipients of the personal data. Then if you're transferring personal data abroad, in the form, they will ask you the countries where you're transferring personal data, and also for what purposes you are transferring personal data. Sorry. Then a general description, you will need to provide a general description of the risk and safeguard you have put in place to protect personal organization in your personal data in your organization. The form normally is in 5 sections, 5 to 6 sections. Section 1, like I've said, the general description of your organization. Section 2, you provide the details of the personal data, categories of data subject, purposes, and recipient. Section 3 is about the special categories of personal data, and section 4 is about transfer. Section 5, safeguards, and 6 is where you insert the number of employees that you have in your organization. So like I've explained earlier, the description would be name, address, telephone number, date of birth, national identity card. So personal data is any information that can identify a living individual. And then we have categories of data subject, employees, customers, shareholders, directors, suppliers, candidates, participants, trainers. These are considered as categories of data subject. You have purpose of processing, payroll, invoicing, know your client, attendance, examination, amongst others, and the recipient National Pension Fund, Mauritius Revenue Authority, Business Registration Department. So you have so many recipients. This will depend on your organization. Each and every organization will have different registration form and different categories of personal data. So like I've said, you need to renew your registration certificate after 3 years. So if you have registered in 2020, then you will need to renew your registration certificate next year, 3 months prior to your expiry date. So if your expiry date is 31st of July, so you will need to renew your registration in April or May 2023. Then you have change of particulars. Change of particulars, whatever you are declaring in your application form, if ever there are any changes afterward. For example, you have declared name, address, and you've said that you didn't have special categories of personal data or sensitive personal data. Now you are implementing for example, biometric attendance system, which collect fingerprints. So you will need to notify the Data Protection Office of these changes that you're processing. You're now processing special categories of personal data, which is biometric. You will have 14 days to notify the Data Protection Commissioner. Then you have cancellation of registrations. Very good that you have obtained your registration certificate, but the commissioner reserves the rights to cancel the registration certificate if any information that you have provided is false or misleading, or if ever you are not meeting your obligation as a data controller or data processor, or whether you the registration certificate, the holder of the registration fails or without lawful excuse to comply with any provisions of the requirements. So even though you are registered as a controller, at any point in time, if you're not abiding by the Data Protection Act, any provisions of the DPA, you will the commissioner may cancel your registration certificate. But before that, the commissioner will send you a notice to explain yourself. You will have time to respond to why you are not complying based on the both parties negotiation and both parties I would say how you have defend yourself with regards to why you are not complying, why you are not maintaining the registration certificate. Then the commissioner may cancel your registration certificate. So with this, we have come to the end of the Mauritian requirements with regards to registration. But I would like to point out that if you have registered as a controller, that doesn't mean you're complying with the Data Protection Act 2017. You need to make sure that you're always abiding, always demonstrating compliance with the Data Protection Act by having the appropriate the right policies and procedures in place, and by notifying, for example, breach within the required time frame, conducting a data protection impact assessment whenever required. So registration, I would say that it is one of the requirements of the Data Protection Act. Registering with the commissioner, with the Data Protection Authority, doesn't mean that you are completely abiding by the Data Protection Act. So with this, I will pass it on to Amit to continue with the registration requirement for Kenya, Uganda, and Rwanda. Thank you.
Thank you, Risha. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. We will go through the registration requirements for Kenya. Basically, the registration requirements under the Kenya Data Protection legislation is under the Section 18(1) of the Kenya Data Protection Act, which states that no person shall act as a data controller or as a data processor if you have not registered with the Data Protection Office of the Data Protection of Kenya, right? So what this means is it's sometimes impractical to state that you should stop processing all personal data. Like, for example, today is the date when the registration commences. So our recommendation is that if you have not started and should you be required to register, you should start your registration as soon as possible. So the commencement date in Kenya for registration is today, and there is no deadline. In Kenya, there was a miscommunication earlier that there was a deadline, but that is not the case. Again, failure to register, and if you've not registered, as per Data Commissioner stakeholders meeting a few days back, that will become a compliance issue. Next slide, please. All right, can I have the next slide, please? The application form is to be submitted online from the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner's office, which commenced today. And this morning, the link wasn't working, but I can happily say that the link is now working, and should you wish to register, you can proceed to do so. The application to be submitted to the Commissioner's office, who will then consider whether or not they will approve the application or request you to amend that. Okay. Upon approval, the Commissioner's office will issue a registration certificate for a period which is valid for 2 years. And after that, you need to renew. Next slide. The registration fees depends on your organization, on how the number of employees and its turnover for the previous years. So if you are a micro and small data controller, data processor, if you are between 1 and 50 employees, the fees is 4,000 shillings. And then the large data controllers, data processors, or below 99 employees, and the turnover over Kenya shillings 50 million, you're looking at the fees of about 40,000 Kenyan shillings. What is going to happen is once you submit your application with all the necessary details and documentation, the Data Commissioner's office will then assess the fees, and then you'll be asked to make the payment. Payment can be made through a bank account, M-Pesa, or you can, I believe you can also do it in person. Well, I think you can do it by check, but I'm not sure about that. But of course, there are various modes of payment. The important part is public entities also need to register, so do charities and religious entities. Public entities are not, like, for example, not the ministries, but any of these sub-ministries, any of the departments. So, for example, under the Ministry of Transport, they do not need to register as a ministry, but then if you are, say, NTSA, you do need to register. Next slide. I will now run you through quickly what the particulars of the application form. The application form for Kenya is divided into 7 specific sections. So first of all is the name and address of the applicant, which obviously is going to be the organization in most cases. What the Data Commissioner's office is also going to do, just to verify the authenticity of your application, they will check with the BRS. For those who are not from Kenya, BRS is a business registration service. So they will link with the BRS where they will be checking for whether the organization is registered or not. Second one, they will register, they will ask you for the description of personal data to be processed by the controller or the processor. So there is a whole host of items which form part of personal data. So this can be names, email addresses, your address, property address, physical address, your phone numbers. And then section 3 also deals with a description of sensitive personal data to be processed by the controller processor. So some of you may ask is why are they why is sensitive personal data separate from personal data? The reason for that is that sensitive personal data needs to be given extra special treatment. So this is data similar to what we call the your biometric data, facial recognition, and even family details and property details are actually classified as sensitive personal data under the Kenya Data Protection Act. We need to treat it more sensitively and give it a special category. Name and description of any country to which the proposed controller intends or may wish indirectly or directly to transfer the data. So what that means is, again, if you are an organization based in Kenya, you are transferring data to Uganda or Tanzania, you need to specify that. Obviously, if you are also going to be transferring data and you are using cloud services, say, for example, AWS or Microsoft OneDrive, Google Drive, that also amounts to data transfers. So you need to make sure that you have mechanisms in place when you're transferring the data, and then you disclose that. Section 5 is to do with the description of risks, safeguards, security measures, mechanisms to ensure the protection of personal data. Now, at this stage, I wish to emphasize that section 4 and 5 are highly critical, especially when you register with the Kenya Data Protection Data Commissioner's Office. The reason for that is, as my colleague Rushta said earlier, you need to have your compliance in place, and the registration is not be all and end all. Right, so you need to identify the risks which you have identified, the safeguards you have put in place, the security measures and mechanisms to ensure the protection. Security measures such as technical and organizational measures, which we will be touching on considerably in the upcoming webinars. And then section 6 goes on to the number of employees of the data controller or the data processor. And then finally, the turnover of the organization for the preceding year. So number 6 and 7 is basically just for purposes of identifying, assessing what fees you have to pay. Yeah, so that's more on the particular application form. Next slide. We will now go into the registration requirements for Uganda. I had a webinar this morning. Again, the director of the National Personal Data Protection, the National Personal Data Protection Office of Uganda, excuse me if I got that wrong, was on the webinar as well. And like Kenya, there is no threshold for registration of turnover or employees. Right, so even if you have 2 employees, you're processing personal data, you need to register. Okay, and the registration commenced on 31st of December 2021. Right, so you need to start registering. So under the Data Protection Act of Data Protection Laws of Uganda, under section 29, as you can see, it is very similar to Kenya and Mauritius, that you need to mandatorily register with the commissioner to act as a data controller, as a processor. Again, failure to register is an offense. Okay, next slide. The application form, same as the one for Kenya, can be submitted online. And there is an application form for registration renewal as a controller or as a processor. and it can be submitted on the PDPO's website. The application to be submitted to which will be submitted to the National Personal Data Protection Director, who will then consider, and then they'll approve, disapprove, or ask to amend the application. Unlike Kenya and Mauritius, the registration certificate is issued and is valid for a year. Okay, next slide. The registration fees are fairly straightforward for Uganda. So the first registration fees is basically US dollars 30 and 100,000 Kenyan shillings, or and renewal fees of 100,000, sorry, Uganda shillings. Next slide. This again, the application form is divided into various sections. So again, it is very similar to the one of Kenya, but again, it's slightly different in that it is asking for the duration for which the data is to be kept and a written undertaking. So again, section 1, the name and address, description of the data protection officer. Section 3 is a description of the personal data to be processed by the controller and the processor. Coming just going a little back to section 2, the director for the National Data Protection Office in Uganda this morning said that you can appoint an organization to handle the data protection requirements. So it does not have to be an internal and external organization, but internal data protection officer. It can be an external organization, but then the data protection officer in that external organization has to be named in that section 2 with the specific details, who are the actual contact details, right? Section 3, description of the personal data to be processed. Section 4, description of the purpose for which the data is to be collected or processed. Section 5, the list of persons or bodies with whom data may be disclosed for purposes and the purpose for the disclosure. Section 6, again, this is very similar to the one in Kenya. So the list of countries which you are transferring the data to, purpose of the transfer, and a brief description of the data transferred. And section 7, again, very similar to the one for Kenya, is the general descriptions of risks, safeguard security measures, and mechanisms to ensure the protection of the personal data. So section 7, section 6, section 5 are imperative, and section 4 as well, because this is where majority of the work will lie, in the sense that you will have to comply with most of these things before registration. But should you register before completing your compliance, by all means you can do that, but you need to ensure that you are in compliance with your the regulations ASAP. So I do not need to overemphasize the importance of section 6 and section 7. Okay, section 8 and section 9, the duration for which the data will be kept and a written undertaking. Now, like Mauritius, Uganda also makes any breaches of data any breaches actually liable with criminal penalties. Fortunately, at the moment, we do not have any such criminal penalties yet in Kenya Data Protection Act. So you can see the gravity and the seriousness with which this approach should be taken. Right. And again, the fines are they're pretty heavy in all 3 countries. Well, 4 countries. An aggrieved party, not only you get fines from the Data Commissioner's office, but also the claimant can go to a court to claim for damages. And then proving those damages is not going to be that difficult. And as you very well know, those who are lawyers in this webinar, that the damages can run into millions. Okay, next slide, please. Rwanda, the registration requirements for Rwanda, the registration has not yet commenced. However, the law came into force under the Protection of Personal Data and Privacy Law number 58 of 2021, and which says that a person who intends to be a data controller or a data processor must register with the supervisory authority. So the supervisory authority in Rwanda is equivalent to the Office of the Data Commissioner's Office in Kenya, or the one in Uganda, or the one in Mauritius. Again, failure to register is an offense under the DPR. Next slide. Currently, as I said earlier, the law provides that there's a transitional period for a period not exceeding 2 years from the date of publication of the official gazette for registration of controllers and processors who are already in operation to confirm the operations with the provisions of the law as per Article 67 of the law. Now here there is a moratorium period for compliance, and compliance starts sometimes in October 2023. So all organizations who are processing personal data will be required to put their house in order insofar as data protection is concerned, to ensure that they are in compliance. And the supervisory authority may also put a regulation in place determining the additional requirements to be met by the applicant for the registration as a controller, as a processor. So similar again to Kenya, you may find that regulations will be, you will find regulations will come into force sometimes maybe in the tail end of this year or early next year for purposes of registration in the Rwanda under the Rwanda Data Protection Act. So I would suggest you keep an eye out for that. Yeah, next slide. So now, how can we assist you at BDO? As you very well know, BDO is an international organization with considerable wealth of experience, and I think I will leave to my colleague Rushta or Zahir to explain how we can help. Thank you.
Thank you, Amit. Actually, yes, we can assist you with regards to a gap assessment. What will we do in this phase is we will analyze your current compliance with regards to data protection, and then we will provide you with a gap assessment report. What are the risks? What are the major findings that we have found out? And then the recommendations to be compliant with the Data Protection Act. Then we have the data protection remediation and implementation. In this process, we draft policies in accordance to your organization, customized to your organization, in order to comply with Data Protection Act 2017, the Data Protection Act 2019 for Kenya, as well as for Uganda and Rwanda. There are different types of policies that will be drafted in this phase, like the privacy policies, notices, procedure to handle breach, procedure to handle any request received, and then contract clauses templates will be provided to you, so that if ever you're having any controller processor relationship, you can use the controller processor agreement. If you're transferring personal data abroad, then it would be another set of agreement that you will need to put in place. Then we have a data protection audits. A data protection audits, we normally do this when you already have your appropriate data protection framework in place. Then we come and assess your compliance with regards to Data Protection Act. We even do this for Data Protection Act and GDPR as well. Then we have the function as data protection officer as a service, like Amit has just said for Uganda, that the commissioner has informed that a data protection officer can be an outsourced one, can be another organization. So we as BDO can act as an outsourced data protection officer to your organization. And finally, we provide we provide trainings and workshop on data protection. We provide staff awareness training, data inventory workshop to help you do the data inventory exercise, because it is very important to know that for you to register, to be able to fill in the registration form, you need to do the data inventory exercise. You need to know what personal data each and every department in your organization are processing and for what purposes you are processing the personal data. So this workshop would be very helpful for you to normally register with the data protection authority. Normally, when we do this data inventory workshop, we provide you with a template of a data protection sheet. You can it's an exercise that we are going to do it together. We fill in the sheet together with the help of video. Then we have some privacy tools training with regards to audit and other types of tools regarding privacy. We also assist you as an organization to register. Normally, we do so through the data inventory exercise. And at the end, we help you to fill in the form, and then you submit and pay the required fees to the data protection authorities. So this sum up a bit how BDO can assist you with regards to your data protection framework. I know that for some, it might be not that easy to draft policies and procedures or implement data protection in your organization, but we here, Amit, we have a great team at BDO, and we will surely help you and your organization to implement the appropriate framework, data protection framework in your organization. So with this, we have reached an end to this webinar. If you have any question with regards to this webinar, to registration, please feel free to contact Zahir. You will see the contact information on the screen, as well as the telephone number and the email address. And if ever you need more information with regards to privacy, you can also contact Sylvie, who is a privacy partner of BDO in Mauritius. This is her email address as well as telephone number. Then we have the last part of this webinar, which is on question time. So I will pass it back to Moses, who will then take up the question and so that we panelists can answer to the question. Thank you.
Right. Thanks, Rushda, Amit, and Zahir. Well, the conversations and presentations were going on for me the whole time. I kept thinking this webinar came in timely. It's coming at a time where the data privacy laws in different jurisdictions are evolving faster than we would imagine. So it's only timely for us to have these sort of conversations to avoid the penalties that come with non-compliancy. But also, like Zahir says, data is the new oil. With accurate data, with the right policies in place, there's so much that you can do with your data. And so again, I think this was very insightful for all of the participants here. And I hope that we've all learned a thing or two that we will be going back home with. So I will now just see what questions have been asked. I see a question from Nzomo. Okay, Nzomo. Nzomo asks, is there a checklist from Kenya Odpc against which organizations can assess their compliancy levels? Amit, I believe this would be passed to you. And then we have a question from our frequent attendant, Ouso. And Ouso says, what's the priority determinant for registration fees in Kenya? Is it the number of employees or turnover? The two may not necessarily align as per the schedule in the presentation. Section 5. Oh, okay. So that's one part of the question. Let me just read that again. What's the priority determinant for registration fees in Kenya? Is it the number of employees or turnover? The two may not necessarily align as per the schedule in the presentation. Then he asks question 2. Section 5 on security measures, is it is it up to the entity to define or choose what works for it, or is it controlled by the Kenya Data Office? Amit, I hope the question is clear.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So then we go to Effie. Effie asks, how does an organization know they need to register? Rushda, I think this will go to you. Or as long as you deal with people's data, or even though just payroll. I believe the question here, Rushda, is how does an organization know that they need to register? Is it, if you're only dealing with payrolls, does it still necessitate you to register for data protection? And then we lastly have a question from Jackie. And Jackie asks, how long does it take for the registration certificate to be issued after completion of registration of the registration process in Uganda? I believe this will also go to Amit. So Amit, that's 3 questions for you and 1 question for Rushda.
Thank you. Moses, I always believe in equal opportunities. Anyway, okay. Now, is there a checklist from Odpc's office? No, there is no checklist against which organization need to assess their compliance levels. But what happens is you need to, first of all, as my colleague Rushda said earlier, you need to have do your data inventory. And one of the things which will come up very, very glaringly in that data inventory is how compliant are you among a set of robust checklists which we will can do for you at BDO, right? And once you have that robust checklist, that will actually form your basis, foundation, and a roadmap for your compliance levels. Yeah, does that answer your question?
Amit, maybe I can add on this. Actually, we at BDO, we had to prepare a free assessment, free self-assessment tool, which we can help you as an organization in Kenya or Uganda to know your privacy status, your compliance level. So after this webinar, whoever is interested in having this free assessment tool, please feel free to contact us. We will share this with you. Thank you.
Then the next question is the priority determinant for registration of fees in Kenya. Is it number of employees or turnover? It is employees and turnover, not employees or turnover, right? And you need to submit to the Odpc's office the number of employees and turnover, and then they will assess the fees. Okay. And the second question is on security measures. Is it up to the entity to define or choose what works for it, or is it controlled by Kenya Data Office? No, it is the compliance with the Odpc's office in Kenya. It is like self compliance. So you are free to choose your security measures, but remember one thing is that should there be a data breach in future, the form which you submit to the Odpc's office, whether the data commissioner's office, whether it's in Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, Mauritius, or Rwanda, that will form basis of your audit. So, and you need to also state in that section what security measures you have in place. As I said earlier, you do not have to have all your security measures in place for registration, because you have to register as a data controller, as data processor, as soon as practical possible to act as a data controller and as a processor. So you can always continue to work on your security measures. Also need to state at this stage is that compliance, even once you have done your full compliance process, compliance is an ongoing process. It is not a one-stop and you do it for once and then you forget about it. You constantly have to review that. Okay. And then, yeah, I think those were the 2 questions. And yeah, I'll leave that the stage to Rushda now.
Yes, the next question was about how does an organization know they need to register, or as long as you deal with personal data in Bandu, just for payroll purposes, you have to register. So if you as an organization are processing personal data, that is personal data, any information that can identify a living individual, for example, name, address, telephone number, your postal address, your email address, your marital status, salary details, bank account details, and any types of personal data. If you're processing personal data and you're determining the means and purposes of these personal data, then you will need to register as a data controller with the organization. So yes, even though if you're just doing a payroll purposes, if you're determining the purposes, you will be considered as a data controller. But if you're doing so on behalf of another organization, then you will be considered as a data processor. So whenever you are processing personal data, the word processing is very large. Processing means anything collecting, sharing, disclosing, and manipulating personal data. So whenever you're processing personal data, you will be considered as either a data controller or a data processor. Thank you.
Right, thanks Rushda, and thanks Amit. So we'll just take another round of questions.
I think there was one more last question, which I think I missed. This is from Jackie.
ahead.
How long does it take the registration certificate to be issued from Uganda? I don't think there is any time frame. One of my clients, they have a company in Kenya and Uganda. So they had applied for registration in Uganda. This was sometimes in December. So it took them almost 4 to 6 months to get a registration certificate. The important part is that you apply for registration and pay for it, and then wait for them to come back to you.
Okay, perfect. So we'll just take another quick round of about 3 questions. We have Dennis, and Dennis asks, are audit firms required to register for the same since they too handle client data? Rushda, I'll send that to you. We have an anonymous attendee who was asked, are there specific requirements for an organization to qualify as a data privacy controller or processor? Okay, so I will send that to Amit. We'll do equal distribution this time. All right.
I think that just Moses, the two question, this one I have replied it earlier, so maybe we can just pass through it quickly.
Okay, so I'll proceed. In case of an unsuccessful registration application, calling for reapplication, does this call for another payment of registration? I believe the question here is, if the registration is unsuccessful, do you need to repay when you re-registering? Rushda, I'll give that to you as well. And then Owusu asks again, does the act then define who is exempted? Imagining hospitals, banks, do they have to stay compliant? Amit, I'll send that to you. Then lastly, again, I think Amit, equal distribution has failed here because the last question is directed to Kenya. So they ask, from where can I access a copy of the Kenyan Act? And we'll go ladies first. Rushda?
So the question is on, are audit firms required to register for the same, since they too handle client data? Yes. If you are processing client data, then you would be required to register as well with the Office of the Data Protection Commissioner. I would say that audit firms also have employees. If your firm have employees, so you will be processing personal data of your employees as well. So you would be considered as a controller, and you will have to register for processing personal data of your client and as well as your employees. Then we have the question, Amit, if you don't mind, can I answer the question with regards to data private controller and processor? I've explained it earlier, a data controller is any organization which which determines the means and purposes of processing personal data. That is, you decide how you are going to process personal data, makes you a data controller. Whereas a processor is when you are processing personal data on behalf of another organization. So the difference is that the processor does not have any decision-making power with regards to a controller. So a controller, it decides the purpose and means of processing, and the processor acts upon the instruction of the controller. Then we have another question with regards to registration. In case of unsuccessful registration application, calling for reapplication, that this call for another payment of registration. So I think that this will need to be clarified with the data protection commissioner, with the data protection office, if ever you have submitted an application and it has failed, whether they would consider it to pay it again, or whether they would need to they would consider your previous application. So I think as and when this will be stabilized, everything would be, you will have every information on behalf of the authority. I'll pass it to you, Amit, for the other questions.
Thank you. So the next question is, does the Act define who is exempted? Imagining hospitals, banks have to say compliant. Now, yes, the Act does define who is exempted. So first of all, the exemption, anybody with the turnover less than 5 million or less than 10 employees is exempted, right? And then state corporations like ministries are exempted. And I believe there is national security agencies are also exempted. However, they're under the Schedule 3 of the data protection regulations, the data protection general regulations 2021. This is for Kenya. They state those who have to mandatorily register, right? And there's a whole list of, I think, 13 to 14 types of data controllers or processors, ranging from banks, organizations, hospitals, insurance companies, telecommunications, gambling, those who are doing CCTV, property agents. All those must mandatorily register, even if they do not meet the threshold for employees or turnover. Okay, I'm not sure whether there is a similar provision for Uganda or Mauritius, but you have to check that. From where can I access a copy of the Act? I will put some access to the website. On my website, I've got all the regulations and the Act in place. So I'll just put it on the chat at the moment, and you can get all that in there, including all the forms, right? So you should be able to get all the forms as well from there. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Amit. Thanks, Rushda, once again. So we have come to the very end of our webinar today. And as we close this, I'd like to give our presenters one more opportunity to share with us their final thoughts out of all that has been said, out of all they've shared. What are those key things they think we need to carry home with us? And I'll start with Zahir. Zahir, what do you think we need to carry home? And then we'll move to Rushdan and Amit.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Yes, we can.
Excellent. Yeah, well, I think the key message for us here is this is an area that's not very clear. So it's quite a difficult thing to do all by yourself. It's one of those areas where it's best, because of the penalties, because of the risk of non-compliance, it's best to get an expert advisor. So, basically reach out to us in any of those areas that Rushda mentioned, and we'd be very happy to spend some time and to help you weave through this journey. Thanks, Moses.
Thanks, Zahir. Indeed, we'll be happy to support wherever there's a challenge. Amit, let the lady go last this time. Amit.
Yes, sorry, you want me to go first? Okay.
Yeah, your final thoughts.
Sure, certainly. Yeah, I mean, they as clearly say, data is a new gold. I would also say data is a new trust, right? Trust is irreparable. Oil can still be replenished. And the other thing is when you are doing data protection compliance, the important part, in as much as it sounds daunting, it should not be daunting, right? One thing you just need to understand as organizations is, would you like your personal data to be treated in a way which you are treating the other person's personal data? So remember, data protection stems all the way from human rights. So if you are not expecting your data to be treated in such a way, why should you treat anybody else's personal data that way? If you have a privacy mindset first, data protection will become very easy. That is very important to state at this stage. Now, on that note, I'll also state that all the data commissioners' offices, Uganda, Kenya, they have an open door policy. If you have any questions, you can ask us. You can even call their offices, and they'll be more than happy to help. Yeah, and with that, all the best, and let us know how we can help.
Thanks, Amit. That brings us to the golden rule: do unto others as you'd like it to be done to you. So you want your data protected a certain way, you ought to protect another person's data. Rushda, final thoughts?
Yes, I think that Amit and Zahir has said it all. So yes, like Zahir said, the data is a new oil. Amit said that you need to protect the personal data like you're protecting your personal data. So yes, you will need to take as an organization, have the required policies and procedures in place to protect the personal data in your organization. And I would say that we at BDO are here to help you. If ever you have any issues, please feel free to contact us. We will meet with you, we will reassure you, and we will see how we can help you to implement data protection in your organization. I think that with this, I think that you had a fruitful session, and wish you all the best with regards to compliance with the Data Protection Act 2019 in both Uganda, Kenya, and Rwanda as well.
Awesome. So thank you everyone for making this happen. Zahir, Amit, Rushda. I believe we'll be together for the next episodes to put the word out as much as we can. Our role is to give you this information as participants. We don't expect you to digest all of it in a go. So we keep breaking it down in bits and pieces, different episodes that you can digest. So we believe by the time we're done with these episodes, you should have the basic knowledge of data privacy. I was going to say you should be experts, but I'll keep it at basic knowledge. Otherwise, we thank you all and we hope to see you in the next episodes. This brings us to the end of today's part. And again, we appreciate all your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.